seminar. Special thank you to Eugene, who is not even here, but he was just in my office, and then I forgot that we have the seminar too. Anyway, so we welcome Ken, our new PhD student, or Michael's new PhD student. He's a little bit possessive.
And Michael, which is new PhD student?
There is the other guy who disturbed me. And he's going to talk about suicide tendencies in young adults and what he's planning to do. And take it away.
Thank you, Thomas. So this project is all about predictive modelling, and I've got two titles up here because at the start of this project it was meant to be all about youth suicide prediction and youth suicide prevention. It's evolved a little bit since then, so what I've got is one title that corresponds to what's in HDR Hub at the moment, and my second title, Predicting Self-Harm Among Psychiatric Inpatients, is what I'm actually working on right now. So it's quite a narrow scope. I've got one particular data set that I'm going to be looking into in a lot of detail, building a model with that, and then throughout my PhD, hopefully it'll open up a little bit and I can maybe look at information flow through a psychiatric ward in a hospital, and hopefully lots of comparing models as well. So fortunately I've got all my supervisors with us. Everyone knows Michael Small. Michael Chiron is from psychology. He's very, very familiar with the data set that I'm going to introduce, and Marwish is helping me with the machine learning. So the prevalence of suicide worldwide, we have around 700,000 deaths per year according to the World Health Organization, which is around 9 deaths per 100,000. The suicide rate in Australia is a little worse than that, hovering around 12, 13 deaths per 100,000 people, depending on the year. And according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we have 1 in 2 people impacted by suicide by the age of 25, which I think really shows how connected we all are to one another, given a fairly low prevalence rate. But suicide is definitely a leading cause of death, especially when you break it down by age. So, of course, suicide is very tragic, and survivors of suicide can experience all of these terrible problems, which I've read in the literature is even worse than death by a lot of other means. Isolation, possibly because it's a socially unacceptable way to die, complex grief, major depression, and we also have youth more likely to die of suicide, prolonged grief in 6 others on average, and someone's gone ahead and worked out an economic cost as well, $2.8 million per young person lost to suicide, mainly on lost earnings, but also bereavement costs and the grieving family not turning up to work, all that sort of stuff. So this is what motivates my research. Different subgroups of the population have vastly different risk profiles for suicide and self-harm as well. For example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have double suicide completion rate, and then LGBTIQ community has this problem is much greater for them, and especially transgender people. So I read one study from La Trobe University that said it's even worse for transgender males than females. Very small sample size, only about 160 transgender males, but more than half of them reported making a suicide attempt. Although fairly small sample size, I've read similar other studies. So from a modelling perspective, this increased vulnerability by different subgroups is sort of in a sense, a trivial thing to predict. I mean, if you've got a linear model, you'd have different intercepts. If you've got another model, it's not really difficult to feed in demographic data and adjust for that. But there also turns out to be a lot of other complexities with vulnerability to suicide. And I'm going to give two examples. One is the gender paradox. So females are far more likely to attempt suicide. They're more likely to have suicidal ideation, a suicide plan. Males are more likely to commit suicide. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics says in 2021, 75% of deaths by suicide were male. Males also more likely to be intoxicated, and we have some authors in the literature suggesting we have different underlying risk processes for males and females. Then differences across age also go well beyond, the complexities go well beyond different levels of risk vulnerability. We also have differences in risk factors. So at a very high level, we can categorise risk factor as interpersonal. You know, how do our peers in our family, how do we perceive our peers and family think of us? Cognitive, how often do you think about suicide? And mood, anxiety and depression. So young people are reported to be more impulsive, more reactive to social adversity, and also much more sensitive to difficult life experiences, while older people tend to be much more robust to handling difficult life events, and tend to die more through tiredness of life, depression or economic problems. And then another interesting thing about this is it sort of does tend to line up a little bit with neurological development. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop at around age 25, and also the first part of the brain to senesce at, depending on the literature, somewhere around age 70. So we've got quite different interplay of risk factors potentially according to age. And suicidal risk is usually introduced in the literature as a function of suicidal desire and suicidal capability. Suicidal desire, how much is someone thinking about suicide or intending to commit suicide, whereas suicidal capability is tolerance to pain and fear. So the more somebody experiences pain and fear over their lifetime, and the more they harden to that, the more risky the suicidal desire is. And this really brings us to why suicide ties in with self-harm. So what I'm really trying to do is predict self-harm, but committing self-harm over a long time increases the danger of suicidal desire, and I'll go into that in a minute. So here we have cusp catastrophe theory. We have a three-dimensional behaviour surface, so desire, suicidal risk and capability. If somebody has a very low capability for committing suicide, they'll tend to move up and down this surface according to this model. So if somebody would have a very low capability for suicide, they might experience some desire to commit suicide, but will return to a stable point. Over years of committing self-harm, so it might start with wrist scratching, maybe develop to something more serious. You have the whole process becoming less predictable, and we have this bifurcation area where, according to the model, an individual who has a high capability for committing suicide might skip suicidal planning altogether and might skip suicidal ideation altogether. That's backed up with backed up with survey-based research. Up to half of those who engage in suicidal behaviour deny experiencing suicidal ideation, according to the same author that was introducing this model. So half of people who engage in suicidal behaviour said they had no thoughts of committing suicide. It's very likely that there's response and recall bias there, but of those half, we assume that some of them actually went straight from not intending to commit suicide into suicidal behaviour. So when we think about this from a modelling perspective, it outlines some of the complexity involved. Firstly, we've got a dynamic system, and for those who have high suicidal capability, a discontinuous process in the sense that suicidal planning might be skipped altogether. Perth Clinic is a hospital, psychiatric hospital located just on the other side of Kings Park, and they have given me access to a fairly large data set. So this single data set is really the sole purpose of my research at the moment, along with developing a predictive model based on this data. All the patients are voluntary. They're there for a range of mental health conditions. People end up in this hospital because they've been referred by a GP or a psychiatrist, and they stay in the hospital as long as they're discharged by a psychiatrist, usually. So what Perth Clinic want is to be able to predict who's most at risk of self-harm and when, and they want this knowledge so that they can intervene. They'll send a nursing staff or a psychiatrist into the person's room, talk about what's going on, offer a range of treatments, and I don't know anything about the interventions as such. If you have any questions at the end, maybe we can get Michael's help to explain what that's about. So really, from an administrative point of view, this is all about targeting resources effectively and efficiently, because they don't have enough resources to intervene. They really want good quality information. Also, an intervention might not be effective if a person isn't actually at heightened risk at the particular time. So this data set comprises of 3 parts given to me as CSVs. I don't need to access any databases or anything. We have a lot of admission data, which is demographics. I'll go into that a bit. And then we've got a whole lot of questionnaires, collecting background information about their state of mind, substance use. And I'll go into this in a bit of detail this time so that you really get a good sense of what the data is, what the problems are, you know, what we've got access to. Then at a later seminar, I'd like to get into the modelling more. So we've got admissions data, what they call the daily diary data. Every patient in the hospital has access to an iPad. They're presented with a questionnaire every day. I'll get into the questionnaire in a minute. And they can choose to, if they want, answer any or all items from the questionnaire at any time of the day they choose. And then the last part of the data is the incident reports that are observed by the clinical staff at the hospital. So if we go into the admissions data, I mean, we've all seen a spreadsheet, but this is what it looks like. We've got medical record number on the far left, then date of birth, sex, date of birth, date of death, how many times they've been admitted before, whether they're inpatients or day patients. So I'm only looking at data from inpatients. And then this is quite a large spreadsheet spreading over 192 variables. We've got information. We've got information that isn't actually directly relevant to predicting. Postcode of the patient, the referring GP or physician, a whole lot of treatment categories, and then also all of these questionnaire results. I'll go into these questions.
How many rows is that spreadsheet?
Sorry?
How many rows of data do you have like that?
I'll go into that in a minute because I'm going to talk about the whole data set combined. But I will just say that these 3 spreadsheets that I've got are all combined into a single data set. via the medical record number, which uniquely identifies the patient, and the date. So we've got admission date for joining daily data to admissions data, and incident date reporting joining the self-harm incidents to the rest of the data. So these questionnaires, we've got assessing depression and anxiety, quality of life, a mental health questionnaire, and alcohol screening tools, as well as the daily data. Here's an example of one of the forms that patients are presented with on admission. We've got questions like, and by the way, all of this questionnaire data is all on a Likert scale. So here, 0 to 3 scale, never to almost always. I felt that life was meaningless. I felt scared without any good reason. I felt that I was rather touchy. I didn't feel like I was worth much as a person. And this Health of the Nation outcome scale is assessed by a clinician. So this is one of the questionnaires that is not self-reported. And we've got one question here that particularly relates to this study. How much of a problem is non-accidental self-injury? All of these are 0 to 4 scales, 0, no problem at all, to 4, very much a problem. This is how that one question that I'm most interested in is coded. So the clinician asks questions. I don't know what those questions are. From the responses, they categorise no problem at all, fleeting thoughts about ending it all, but no self-harm, mild self-harm, fairly serious self-harm, or serious risk of suicide attempt or serious deliberate self-injury. So I'm just moving through the admission data to get a feel for how much information we have access to, how much background information we have access to. So alcohol screening tool, I assume these are all summed, but for every one of these we have information on the individual items. So questions like, how often during the last year have you been unable to remember what happened the night before? How often have you been unable to control the amount you drink? Blah, blah, blah. Then the quality of life questionnaire goes into just quality of life generally over work, living, economic status, mobility, vision, hobbies, medication. And then onto the most interesting part. So this project really focuses on what we call the daily diary data. So in the psychology space, they refer to the self-report questionnaires of this type as either ecological momentary assessments, which are multiple times a day, or daily diary data, which is collected a single time a day. Like I said, inpatients can choose to answer or not answer any questions, and they can complete this at any time of day. The responses are usually inputted into a touchscreen. They can have clinical staff entering the data if they're not able to. So all of these questions belong to psychological constructs that have been well developed in the psychological literature over decades, usually coming first from psychological theories of suicide and then validated using question responses. So we've got the first set of items, the only positive ones I have to show you, unfortunately. But we've got well-being from World Health Organization developed scale. So I'm going to read each of these items one at a time because this is really the central thing of my project. I felt cheerful and in good spirits. I felt calm and relaxed. I have felt active and vigorous. I've woken up feeling fresh and rested. My life has been filled with things that interest me. These are all protective factors. If somebody's high on the scale for these, we would assume they're at very low risk of self-harm and also of suicide. This is a 6-point scale, 0 at no time to 5 all of the time. Then the next 5 are assessing psychological distress. I've felt anxious, I've felt depressed, I've felt worthless, had thoughts about killing myself. We call this the suicide ideation question. I've felt that I'm not coping. And then these are more recent constructs. Michael and others have shown that perceived burdensomeness can be a very strong predictor of suicide. So there's questions, felt my death would be a relief to others. This is also, this is 0 to 6, 0 to 7? 1 to 7 scale, thanks. Felt like my death would be a relief to others, felt like a burden on others, and sense of social belonging. I felt supported by others and felt close to others. These are often reverse coded, so we have a lack of belonging. And then wish to live, wish to die. I'll go into that a little bit in a minute, but it turns out that wish to live and wish to die are not just inverse of each other, they are separate constructs. And hopelessness is a construct associated with suicide developed from the 60s onwards. And then these categories really aren't very useful to me but we also have the observational incident data. A clinical staff might notice somebody has committed or is committing self-harm of some type, and they'll record whether or not there is a self-harm event, and 21 categories seems like quite a lot of information. So really, for my purpose, we're just looking at whether there has been a self-harm event or not. So with the self-harm data, we've got, back to Devon's question, how much data do we have? So when I join all the data together, the admissions data, the daily diary data, the incidence of self-harm, we've got every row represents 1 patient day and is around 450,000 patient days of data, and around 2,500 days where there's been a self-harm event. Just give you a brief overview of the data from this period, which is end of 2008 up to 2022. So I've got more than 10 years of data, 10,000 inpatients, as I said, around getting close to 500,000 records. Variable length of stay, because patients are usually there until they're discharged. On median length of stay is 14 days, mean 17 days, minimum 0, maximum all the way up to 191. And this data has a lot of missing responses, again because the patients can choose whether or not to answer the questions. So we've got, on average, a patient will answer questions for about 60% of the days that they're there. And here, this graph is showing me what the response rates are for each of those 17 items I went through. Can we come back to questions? This is only for patients who've stayed for 40 or more days, so most patients haven't been there that long. There's not a lot of data in this picture, but when I look at patients that have been there for 14 days, obviously I've got not hundreds but many thousands more data, and we have these spikes are less pronounced, but the pattern is exactly the same. So we've got definitely a decrease of information from the daily diary over the length of a patient's stay, and these spikes corresponding to 7-day intervals. I don't know what that's about. We've asked the question and they'll maybe get back to us. this is just giving you an idea of what the raw data looks like. So this is responses for a single item plotted over length of stay, going to 191 for the longest stay, 0 for felt anxious at no time at all, to 5 at the top, felt anxious all the time. And we have loss of data from the left of the picture to the right of the picture, mainly because people are being discharged, but also partly because people are responding less. Just one little feature that I can notice is the people that have stayed for the longest period have this high anxiety scores. Just giving you a really bird's eye view of the profile for all of the 17 items. I've standardised this just by summing all of the scores, dividing by the number of responses, and also dividing by the maximum response category. We have over the blue items on the left corresponding to wellness, then the yellow or orange is the distress items, burdensomeness next, then belonging, wish to die, wish to live, and hopelessness. And I've plotted on the left the data overall, and the right just the data for the self-harm days. So we've got about 200 times more data on the image on the left as compared to the image on the right, and just giving you an idea of how much overall do patients respond in the different categories for the different items. So a few things to notice: the well-being tends to go down overall on the self-harm days. The distress goes up, and then there's a particularly large jump in suicidal ideation, which is this bar here. And we also have, interestingly, both wish to live and wish to die going up. So intuitively, originally I would have thought that the more somebody wishes to live, the less they wish to die, but it actually doesn't turn out to be that way at all. I've plotted the proportions for this pair of items together, and you can actually see a correspondence between, a positive correspondence between wish to live and wish to die. When I first saw this, I thought, oh no, is there something wrong with the data? Then when I thought about it, it seems these people are thinking about living and dying, whereas the people overall, particularly not on the self-harm days, are not.
That's just for the self-harm days, is it?
No, this is for overall. And as indicated by the very high amount of data in the 0-0 response. This is also just giving a sense that the score profile for an individual, the distribution of scores for a single item changes, and we've got the same amount of data as for the previous coloured bar chart, about 200 times more information on the left as the picture in the middle. So we have, for suicidal ideation, a lot of people in the, I haven't experienced suicidal ideation at all in the last 24 hours. And then we also notice here that suicidal ideation, and this pattern I've seen for many of the variables, high distress diminishes when we count back on days from self-harm. So the bar chart on the right is counting back. Day 0 is a self-harm day. And then we're counting back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days from the self-harm event. We're noticing that just looking at the thinking about high response for suicidal desire drops off in the lead up to suicide. This is just looking for patients overall. We've started to plot individual trajectories, and we've still got more work to go on that. This is from a paper published by Michael Chiron and others, and this is also using the same data that I'm working with. On the left, we have contemporaneous, so we're not looking at, so temporal on the right, not temporal on the left. And several features stand out. Firstly, we've got, the nodes are not individual items, they're constructs. We have wish to live, burdensomeness, suicidal ideation is the one we're most interested in, negative affect, positive affect, hopelessness, and thwarted belonging. So some things really stand out here. We've got a negative association as indicated by the red vertice between positive and negative affect, meaning talking about anxiety and depression. We've got a very strong positive association between negative affect and suicidal ideation. And we've also got some constructs that seem to be operating on suicidal ideation indirectly. For example, thwarted belongingness seems to be interacting more strongly with burdensomeness and maybe via burdensomeness acting on suicidal ideation, and very weakly, directly acting or interacting with suicidal ideation. So we've got a fairly complex interaction of risk factors, and we also have good reason to think that this complex interaction of risk factors might be quite different depending on the group of people we're looking at. We're likely to see a much stronger role of burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness for people aged under 25, for example. And the temporal model on the right, we have the circular arrows, autoaggressive associations, indicating that this construct is self-reinforcing. So we have especially negative affect and suicidal ideation seem to be strongly self-reinforcing. This suggests that we've got further complications with modelling. We've got non-linear effects here. And I've gone ahead and worked out responses for each of the categories for pairs of items, so we can think of this as conditional probabilities for each pair. The overall purpose where we're getting to with this is looking at mutual information for each pair of items, then moving on to mutual information for multiple items at a time, trying to inform on how to improve the input space. And really the goal here is, can we build up a model by hand? If we can, it's likely to offer a lot more explanatory power, and it's likely to be, that extra explanatory power might be very useful to the clinical staff. So a couple of things that I can see here is on the very top left corner, quite a strong relationship between depression and anxiety. Also notice that we don't have any data perfectly lining up on the diagonals. It doesn't seem, it's evident from looking at these plots that we have no fully redundant items and no completely independent items. And then this is just the same sort of thing, but we're looking at, sorry if I can go back, all of these are plotting proportions of responses for the anxiety question against all the other questions. And I've done the same thing for all of them. Now we're looking at suicidal ideation. I just wanted to include this because of the contrast here. We've got an item where we have a lot of the data in the 0 category, around 144,000 responses in the 0 category versus 100,000 in all other categories. And you can see with the bar chart as well that if we split it up, sorry, the bar chart is responses for the anxiety question, and for the people who are not in the 0 category, we've got higher responses, and the people who answer yes to, 0 to experiencing suicidal ideation in the day, we've got a lot of responses in the low categories. I might come back to this. No, all right. So this is just really indicating that there's so many tangents and rabbit holes we can go into. We looked at anxiety versus calmness, and this picture on the left seemed a little bit unintuitive at first, because you would think that calmness and anxiety should be very strongly related to one another, and we would expect all of the data to be on the off diagonal, but notice that a lot of the data was in this bottom left corner. It makes perfect sense that people tend to feel neither strongly calm nor strongly anxious. I've kind of stated that in a shorthand way because the questions aren't about intensity, they're about frequency. So I went ahead and separated that data I call the diagonals everything with a combined score. So anxiety score plus calmness of 4 or greater gives you the diagonal plus 1 next to the diagonal. And what I found was that there were differences in the patterns of not coping, and I don't really have a lot of insight about what's going on with the patients here, other than for those responses that were not in the diagonal, we just have a lot of data in this one category for not coping. I don't know, but it really goes to show that we've got human data, we've got an awful lot going on, and it's really important to know what's going on, but there's also the trap of, you could spend forever going into questions like that. So as well as the day-to-day responses being an important predictor, we have fluctuations across the days, especially in the lead up to a self-harm or suicide event, being a very important predictor as identified in the literature. These authors, Wang et al., have developed a very successful predictive model, and this quote comes from them: "Suicidal thoughts are characterised by large within-person fluctuations. Suicide attempts are preceded by large, rapid changes in suicidal thinking." Those particular authors collected data either 4 times a day or 6 times a day. We don't have the luxury of data collected that frequently, but we know that looking at changes in responses, not just the actual values of responses on any given day, is going to add predictive value. I do hypothesise that those fluctuations are going to be different across groups. Here I'm just looking at patients aged under 25 versus patients aged over 25, older patients in the red, younger patients in the blue. It's not actually really telling a story about the data, because I've just picked 10 younger adults versus 10 older adults, and it seems to be generally there's a bit more fluctuation going on. So modelling the amount of fluctuation might not be good enough. We might have to account for other variables as well. And going back to this author Wang et al., they found that probability of acute change was an especially important predictor. Probability of acute change is defined as number of consecutive days that the score has gone up or down by 1 sample standard deviation or more. These authors looked at a group that was a little bit different to our group. These were all men and all hospitalised because they were at risk of suicide. This study based the data was collected from responses to 3 questions, assessing suicidal desire, suicidal intent, and ability to resist suicide. Currently, Perth Clinic do employ a predictive model, and this model is used to inform staff about when a patient is at higher risk. At the moment, the clinical staff can choose to act on these data or not, as I understand it. So we've got data going back to 2009, and since 2000, clinical staff at Perth Clinic have been able to access the output from a predictive model. The model that they uses static predictors only, doesn't take those fluctuations into account at all. And we have really what I think is a fascinating problem, because we don't actually know when the clinical staff are acting on the output from the predictive model. So the model is becoming a bit tangled up with the system that it's trying to predict, which I think means that at the moment it's impossible to calibrate a model. And it also means, from my perspective, I've got a fixed time point. I've got 10 years of data. I'm not getting fresh data because it's going to be biased by, you know, whether or not the nursing staff have acted on the predictive model or not. Michael Chiron has done a little bit, has implemented improvements over this by including dynamic variables constructed from the response data. So I'm including all of the dynamic variables that Michael has used in his predictive model, where he has gained improvements in positive predictive value. So we've got probability of acute change. I've already defined that for you. We've got a simple moving average, a risk sum from the distress items, which is a cumulative deviation of a patient's daily scores from sample averages at a particular day, mean square of successive differences, linear trajectory of the change over time, and person mean-centred daily score. So we've got a whole lot of ways of aggregating data to try and capture those fluctuations. I think with Michael's model, this is where the craft is. And the way his model works is like this. So we've got a lot of missing data. That missing data is imputed using k nearest neighbours. Then all of the data plus those dynamic variables is thrown into the logistic regression model, and Lasso sorts out what's useful and not by shrinking the coefficients of the terms that are not strong predictors, and uses a 3-day predictive window. We've got actually, for this type of predictive model, really excellent performance. So it's identifying the patients that need to be identified, but in doing so we have around 9 out of 10 patients not actually needing intervention. So this is where Perth Clinic hopes that my research can offer them value by having a better predictive value so that resources can be targeted more efficiently. Michael McCulloch was a previous postdoc who also worked in this problem. I'm just going to mention him very briefly. He used support vector machines. He used only current time point and not the dynamic variables. This is just my intuition for how you might capture the fluctuations, just simply what's the gross amount of change over the window you're interested in. It would look something like this on a linear model where the weights are determined by the model. And where we're going from here, I'm not sure exactly, but next time I present to you, I want to have a whole lot of model comparisons. I want to try a classification tree approach, a neural network approach, and probably maybe work on Michael McCulloch's support vector machines as well. In addition to that, really the focus is going to be on building up the model by hand to try and have better explanatory power. Here are some references. As I said, I use the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the World Health Organization for the incidence of suicide. Are there any questions?
So it sounds like road cyclists have a high suicidal risk. We are used to pain and we don't fear for death. So that was my take-home message.
Getting on a bike on the road is suicidal idea.
Yeah, maybe that is already. Any other question? Maybe a little bit more qualified than what I'm saying. Daniel?
Do you see, like, of the approaches that you're thinking about taking, like you mentioned the classification tree or you see an approach working out better than any of the others, or something you're going to go to first?
Well, what I was doing with those green plots and sort of picking things apart, saying, oh, there might be something different, if I can go back to that. The idea that there might be something different happening with these group to the people along the diagonal, and then splitting up like this sort of suggests a classification tree approach to me. I think XG Boost might be something I'd be interested in. I'd try Random Forest as well. I'm not too sure beyond that.
So that's the next.
Exactly.
So there was the first table you had way back at the start where you were showing sort of some example data.
Yes.
You just go back there just a second.
The raw data.
Yeah, raw data. Like with your
This is the raw data. This is raw responses.
Hey, with the patient, like how the ideas.
Oh, right, the mission. Yeah.
So, because I know you talked at the start a bit that obviously gender introduces a bit of bias there. What sort of
Yes.
stands out looking at that is on those rows you've got one row there for males and the rest are all female. Is there a big gender bias in the data set?
There is, and Michael can.
75% female. Right.
And that's a great question.
So
Absolutely, there is a gender.
To make it hard to sort of comment on those things you're talking about at the start, are you trying to look at ways of sort of addressing those questions? Or
So I started out with this project in education, and it was very much geared at youth suicide, and I was very strongly encouraged to be splitting the data up based on psychological evidence and neurological development suggesting that there might be a different risk process happening for young people. The approach that we're favouring is let's do some unsupervised learning to pick out the groups and see whether that lines up with what the psychological stuff is telling us. So if we can cluster or use unsupervised learning and then that lines up nicely with gender and age, that's going to be great. Eugene.
There's still a lot of data for males.
yeah, well, it's a huge data.
10,000 patients.
70 is better than saying
10,000 patients and approximately 1,000 patients that have committed self-harm.
I just got a question. A few slides ahead with the network.
Wrong way.
That one. Oh, yeah. So is this meant to be like, for example, the self loops for like burden? Does it mean that if someone has burden one day, they will more likely have a higher burden like in the next time step ish?
Exactly.
How is that calculated for? Is it just by a correlation or like between? Because I'm just thinking, is this being inputted as like some kind of structure set back into the predictive model? Because it seems like if you have a time trying to predict the next step of.
No, I think this was separate to the predictive model that was used, and this uses an R package, ML var, multi-level, vector autoregression, if I remember right.
And this is just patients that have attempted suicide as well.
Okay.
So the idea is, amongst people that do attempt suicide, what tends to drive other factors? Is it, wish to live and burden driving suicidal thoughts from one day to the next?
Yeah.
That way we can target probably the most efficient construct within therapy. That's the idea behind it.
This is offering some explanatory value, and the predictive models are separate to this. And one area where I might be able to add a lot of value is that we might be able to combine the two together by building up a model by hand. So we might get some sense of this, what's being shown in the network model, but using mutual information, so we're really able to explain what's going on.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, because I'm assuming you have like these measures that are tracked over time of like burdensomeness or negative
Negative effect.
Oh yeah. So like you have this at least 40 time set or something like that, and if you want to include like prediction performance as part of that, I think causation entropy might have something that would do that.
Causation entropy.
Maybe the one is more is geared towards prediction a bit more than mutual information. Because usually like how do I predict the next step if I include this information?
Okay,
But
I'll look into it.
To
Sorry.
clarify, it is saying that the change in these variables is correlated with the autocorrelated with the raw values, or are the raw values correlated? Just clarify.
The raw values. Didn't.
All that discussion leads to the question of, so these are the correlations between the autocorrelations between multiple correlations, temporal correlations, what I mean to say, but presumably there's a drift as well.
A drift.
Yeah, so, you know, the ultimately correlation, a tendency for the variable to reach some particular place. That would be the other, that would sort of be the information that's missing from that picture in terms of predictions and what's going on. So, you know, if everything else were taken out, burden is self-correlated. But does it tend to increase over time or decrease over time, or just stay where it is? You know, any of those could be true and have burden being self-correlated that way, or any of the other variables.
I know at the beginning you were kind of talking about how the aim of Perth Clinic was to kind of improve the effectiveness of the treatment. What kind of like sensitivity to time is there? Like how far can you deviate from giving the intervention where it's no longer kind of as effective? Do you know kind of like, is it 1 day, is it a week, or?
Michael.
Essentially, you want to give the nursing staff enough time in the current iteration to go ahead and find a particular patient and increase observations. The next iteration, once we've got a better performing model, is can we get those people into therapy or deliver some sort of brief intervention for them? For that, we need to know the most efficient target for them. So whatever model that can provide, something that can at least, you know, extract some reliable variable importance, we can target those variables. That's the idea. But currently they're happy with the 7-day window. That way they've got time to prepare and try to find that particular patient over the next few days. But we're playing around with that and finding what they want. So we've trialled 1 day, which is just woefully performing. It's just so hard to predict a rare event like that, to 7 days. And the current model is using a 7-day one, and they seem happy enough with that.
With this data, is there any attempt also to see? So there are two things that I actually want to ask. On the one hand side, the score that you give in these questionnaires is rather subjective.
I think it.
Of, I mean, I might have a good day where everyone else in this room starts to cry if they have the same good day. Yeah?
No, not exactly, because it's measuring frequency, not intensity. So I think it would be much more subjective if they said, how bad did you feel today on a scale of 1 to 5? But the questions are designed to how often did you feel this way during the day? None of the time, some of the time, more than half of the time. So I think
in that case, can you actually use that data to show whether or not these guys are doing a good job in the therapy? Because I assume if someone is in a mental health institution for 190 days, they will get some treatment. I mean, my background, all of my family works in mental health, so I worked during my semester breaks in these institutions. So can we see something like the impact of the therapy on the data set?
yeah, I mean, I think the data set could allow us to do that, but we're not looking at therapy at all for the predictive models at the moment, and the reason is because the therapy doesn't start until some stage into their stay. Really, we're using the same type of data for each patient. So there's more information for patients who have had a longer stay because they've answered the questionnaire more, but we are currently discarding all of the information that isn't shared by all of the patients. So, and then another example is diagnosis. So diagnosis and treatment. A patient might enter the hospital, stayed there for a couple of days, and the hospital really wants to be able to predict, are they at heightened risk or not? There's no information available for those patients on diagnosis and treatment, and we're treating all patients that way.
Nevertheless, I think it's an interesting data set from that perspective as well, that you could actually crunch the numbers and see whether this is working or not, because you would hope that it goes down. Given that I know how many readmissions you see here in mental health hospitals, I am aware that this might not be the golden bullet.
There is definitely a trend over time for most patients where you see improvements in most of their symptoms, if that's what you're referring to. Yeah, not for everyone, but for the large majority. But you think that's something that needs to be taken into account in the models?
Yeah, most likely. I mean, if you are just trying to find something like, and that is, I think, the purpose of this research is trying to find, okay, this patient is at risk, you have to do some monitoring or whatever, then this is good enough, then it doesn't depend on whether he had 50 treatments already or not. But if you also want to know, okay, do these different treatments that they get actually work, it's also in the data set. Yeah.
I think I saw Jeff showing some of the dashboards that we had where you have patients in treatment and you're tracking their responses.
Where they should be going by now.
Yeah.
So once they put them in therapy.
So it's been done.
Well, patient by patient. So
Yeah.
they've got the live dashboard there. You can see the patients that got in hospital. And so this patient put into therapy and these are the responses going down or going up.
It's also done the question, okay, at which level do you really send it back into reality? Okay. So, okay, good. I think, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I claim it's 3 o'clock. And that finishes the seminar. I mean, you said I was too late when I walked in at 2, so it must be starting before 2. Everyone happy? Otherwise, we know where Ken lives. Thank you very much for that seminar.
Thank you.
Next time the gory details of the models.
Yes. And model comparisons as well. I'll bring up all the